Thank you for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Joe, for inviting me. One of the things that wasn't said in the bio sketch there was that I spent a period of time on the dole when I was a good deal younger. And so when I look at the labour market and I look at the issue of unemployment, it's not just a dry academic subject to me. It's something I care deeply about because I know what it's like to be unemployed and to wonder about your future and whether your hopes and dreams are ever going to be realised. And so it's not just an academic issue. It's a very real issue. In talking about unemployment today, what I want to say is that Ireland, I think, is in the process of moving from a passive type of social contract in which we support people to a more mainstream European system where we help people to get back to work as well. And so it's an active response. And what I want to argue is that we can think about this smartly and try and do it right and get it right. And if we do, then we can contribute to solving the problem. But we have to move away from the old ways of doing things if we're going to do that. So just to lay out what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about the scale and nature of unemployment. Then I'm going to talk about movement off the live register, because I think we need to understand something about the way in which the live register is not actually a pool of people. The live register is much more like a lake rather than a pool. And I use that analogy because a lake has a large inflow, but it also has a large outflow. And we need to understand those movements in order to think about solutions to unemployment. I want to talk about the scale of the policy channel. I want to talk about activation and what that means and what we know about activation. I also want to argue that we need to target activation on particular groups. I want to talk briefly about prevention and then just lay out, if you like, in conclusion, a strategic approach to the unemployment problem. Here's just a quick look at total and long-term unemployment over the years 2007-2011. You can see there the total line is inexorably growing. The most recent count, it was just over 14% of the labour force. That's one number we're concerned about. The other number I think that we're very, very concerned about is the blue line. And the blue line represents long-term unemployment. And you can see that that has been rising very, very rapidly over the last couple of years. And so a couple of years ago, long-term unemployment was about 25% of unemployment. And the last time it was measured, the start of 2011, it was over half of total unemployment. So long-term unemployment is fast becoming a really serious problem and a growing scale of a problem. And that's a problem because long-term unemployed people find it more difficult to get back to work. And so we're seeing an emerging structural unemployment problem which becomes increasingly difficult to resolve. This is just a quick picture of who's unemployed, and you can see that in 2011 unemployment is very much a male problem. So 200,000 males unemployed compared to less than 100,000 females. And you can also see that the long-term unemployment problem is particularly challenging because over 60% of men who are unemployed are long-term unemployed. So again, back to that structural issue. So a quick look at who's unemployed by age group. And you can see that there's a large chunk of men there in the ages between 25 and 45. If you like, prime age men make up a very large proportion of unemployed. There's another way of looking at it, that's in terms of risk, or the unemployment rate. And there you can see that young people are hit particularly hard. And so young people under the age of 25 have sky-high unemployment rates, over 30%, over 40% in the case of young males, less than 19. Fortunately, there aren't very many of them, if you look at the graph on the right, but those who are in the labour market who are young are facing sky-high unemployment rates. And they're people who are going to have enduring problems for a long period of time. This is a quick look at the educational composition of unemployment, trying to address that question of who's unemployed. What you can see there is that between 2006 and 2011, first off, you can see the numbers increased greatly, but something also happened, and that was that the educational composition changed. And what's going on there is that during the crisis, and right up to now in 2011, you have a substantial number of people who have third level education and leaving cert education who are now unemployed. And so the educational profile of unemployed people in terms of the composition of unemployment has actually increased. And that's a good sign in a way, because it means that when we go back to a period of economic growth and when we get employment growth, it will be easier to get people back to work because they have skills and they have educational background. These then are the unemployment rates by education and sex, and you have a typical pattern there whereby the higher the level of education, the lower the rate of unemployment. So that Men with primary or below have about 25–26% unemployment rates. Men with degrees, about 5 or 6%. That's a commonly observed pattern that we see it all over the world. What's interesting about this and what's worrying about this is that men and women, both of whom have post-leaving cert qualifications, so more than the second level, are actually showing higher levels of unemployment than people with leaving certs. And what that is reflecting is that people have been getting trained in some of the wrong kinds of things, and that's particularly reflecting people being trained in construction skills who are unemployed. And so that's an unusual feature of the Irish case, that people actually have higher levels of education or are unemployed in the present recession. Okay, just to sum up what I've been saying then is that long-term unemployment is growing. The long-term unemployed find it particularly difficult to find work and to go back to work. They have poorer skills, they have less experience, and their skills deteriorate over time. So the longer you're out of work, the more your skills deteriorate and the less able you are to get a job. We've seen that unemployment is very high among men, large numbers in the 25 to 44-year age group. We've seen that young people face higher rates of unemployment. We've seen that joblessness has increased among the skilled groups, but that unemployment rates are higher for the low to intermediate skills, those people with PLCs, and it's a particular problem for males who've been laid off from the construction sector. There's a very large number of males with lower or intermediate skills in the construction sector who are unemployed and have very long unemployment durations. I guess the other thing to note is that social welfare supports for job seekers in 2010 cost just over 4.4 billion. Sorry, that's billions rather than millions, and that's about 20% of the total social welfare spent. Just to keep that in mind. Now, I talked a few minutes ago about the notion of a lake rather than a pool, and what I want to argue here is that there's substantial movement off the live register continuously. This is looking at the proportion of new entrants, that is, people who are less than 6 months to the live register, who are still unemployed 6 months later. And what that's telling us is that about 40% of people remain on the live register after 6 months or more than 6 months. And that means that about 60% of people are moving off the live register. Now, they're moving off to do various things. Many of them are moving on to jobs, other jobs, and others are going into education and so on. But the point is that there's substantial movement out of the live register. It's not a pool, it's a lake. That's the good news. But that good news also comes with bad news, because over the course of the recession, what's happened is that people who are already long-term unemployed, say people who already have 1 or 2 years of unemployment, have very, very high survival rates. They don't escape. And so I guess the most worrying would be people who were already 2 years unemployed back in 2007, 70% of them were still unemployed a year later. When we get to the current period, 90% of them are still unemployed. And so what's happening is that as the recession deepens, people who are already long-term unemployed, almost all of them are staying unemployed. So they're static if you're already long-term unemployed. So one of the challenges for policymakers is to prevent people from getting into those situations in the first place, because what's been happening is that if they get into long-term unemployment, they don't escape. So what we're seeing then is that there's substantial movement off the live register. Those with short unemployment spells escape quickly because they have higher levels of education and better labour market experience. But the retention of the long and the very long-term unemployed has increased in recent years. And of course, this could undermine employment recovery when it does come. And because of that, unemployment, and particularly long-term unemployment, could persist for a very long time. So that then is the scale of the challenge. Now, if you look then at what we're doing, we can first of all look at the National Employment Action Plan, which is our way of dealing with or responding to the crisis. And the current National Employment Action Plan is to refer clients after 3 months of unemployment. That system at the present, not surprisingly, is overwhelmed. There's just too many people going through the system. We know that many eligible clients fall through the net of assistance, and there's an urgent need for targeting in order to make sure that the system works for those who need it to work. Now, Ireland, and I'm going here on international research, Ireland is unusual in that we have relatively high replacement rates in terms of our income support, but we've got very low levels of activation. We've got very, very underdeveloped systems for getting people back to work. That's an unusual combination, and it's an unfortunate combination. And the OECD have commented that if we had been more like the European norm of having a high level of activation, then we would have started the recession in a far better place than we did. We would have had less long-term unemployed when we started, and we would have been more able to find our way out of it. We still need to develop activation, and just because we have a recession is not a reason for getting activation right now. And the reason for that is that when economic recovery begins, unemployment could remain high for many years unless we have activation measures to keep people connected to the labour market. So the challenge then is to reduce the growth of the long-term unemployment, reduce people's tendency to drift into long-term unemployment. And of course we do that in the context of a fiscal crisis of the state, of which we are all very, very well aware. We don't have resources to bring to bear on this problem. But that means that with very, very little resources, we absolutely have to get value for money. Anything we do, we have to do it smartly, and we have to make sure that it's effective. So we need targeted and effective education, training and employment programs that achieve value for money. So switching from passive support to active support, and when you're actively supporting people, you're doing smart things, you're doing things that work, that help them to get back to work. Now, in terms of labour market activation, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about trying to help people to get back to work. And underlying the notion of labour market activation, there's a notion of a mutual obligation, and the mutual obligation is a deal. It's an extended form of the social contract. It says we want to push active job search, we want to encourage people to improve their employability by increasing their skills in exchange for providing them with income support with benefit payments. Now, this is not uncontroversial because it's effectively changing the nature of the social contract. And I think there are a number of principles that we have to take on board if we're going to change the nature of the social contract. And just to list a few that I think are important, because I've only got a few minutes, I think the first principle is that we should assume that most job seekers want to work. And so we're not about policing people or tricking people. The assumption is that most job seekers, in most situations, do want to get jobs. Second, I think we need to acknowledge that in this country, mass unemployment is a consequence of economic mismanagement. And I think you've probably all heard plenty about economic mismanagement over the course of this week. This is part of the consequence, and one of the most serious consequences of economic mismanagement. So you've got large numbers of people who are unemployed through no fault of their own and never expected to be unemployed. The third thing that we absolutely have to ensure is that if we are requiring people to participate in programs to get back to work, we have to make sure that the programs themselves are effective. That is the state side of the bargain. If you're telling people you have to go on a program, then you have to be very sure that that program will actually be of assistance to them in getting back to work. And finally, and I think this is very important, sanctions as a way of forcing people to comply should be seen as a last resort. And I'll expand on that a little while. So in terms of active labour market programs, what are we talking about? Well, you can think in terms of supply side versus demand side, first of all. In terms of supply side, you can think of job search assistance, which is various kinds of training, counselling, encouragement in job search activities, just basically helping people to find jobs and to look for jobs. Secondly, then you've got more intensive interventions, training, formal training. And training is to enhance people's skills and therefore to enhance people's employment prospects. On the demand side, you've got public sector employment schemes, and those are intended to help people to retain contact with the labour market. And then you've got incentives to employers, and these are to encourage employers to create new jobs or to retain existing jobs. And we've got variants of all kinds of those in the policy mix in Ireland at present. It's useful then, because we care about whether these things work or not, it's useful to reflect very briefly on what is known to work and what is not. And so I've drawn for my next two slides on the international literature and what we know from the Irish research. So in terms of job search assistance, giving people counselling, assistance, encouragement and so on, is known to be effective and it's known to be low cost. So it's an attractive option, particularly for many groups. It's known to be more effective if you combine job search assistance with monitoring on a constant basis every couple of weeks or every month, calling people in and just checking what they're doing and encouraging them and so on, and with sanctions as a last resort, as I said. Now in Ireland, we've just published a report, admittedly going back a few years, but the report found that large numbers of eligible clients fell through the net. Large numbers of eligible clients were not in fact eligible because they'd been helped before. And then those that did receive assistance without monitoring and sanctions actually seemed to be reducing their job search activities. So if we're going to provide people with assistance, we have to make sure that it's a good degree of assistance, it's good quality, and that it comes on a regular, constant basis. So it's not just a single interview, which is what has been going on in the past. In terms of formal training, the evidence internationally is quite inconclusive about whether it helps people to get back to work or not. We've done some work on this in Ireland, most of it I've done myself, And our recent research shows that training does actually increase people's employment prospects. So training is a smart thing to do. Older research shows that particular kinds of training, particularly in specific skills, with strong linkages to the labour market, have the strongest effect in terms of enhancing people's employment prospects. So those are the kinds of things that we should be investing in. On the demand side, in terms of subsidies, the international evidence says that some kinds of employment schemes do help, particularly long-term unemployed people. We know that in terms of self-employment and subsidies to self-employment, there tends to be high deadweight. So lots of people who start businesses would have done so anyway with aid from the state. And they tend to displace other people in businesses. So in other words, if you give somebody a grant to set up a bicycle repair shop in one part of the city, they may actually put somebody else out of business in another part of the city. So you have to be careful how you use them. In Ireland, research that we did at the ESRI in the 1990s showed that subsidising jobs in private sector jobs, that's in real jobs in the real economy, did actually, again, enhance people's employment prospects. So staying close to the market does seem to help people in terms of what works. Public sector job creation internationally has been found to have very, very little effect. This is creating jobs in the public sector for people. Community employment would be the prime example of this kind of scheme in the Irish case. We've done a good deal of work on that, and there's been no evidence that community employment increases the employment prospects of its participants. It may do lots of good work for communities around the country, but it doesn't enhance the employment prospects of their participants. And we've looked at recent evidence that suggests that having participated in a community employment scheme actually leads to longer spells of unemployment rather than shorter spells of unemployment. And that's consistent with the international research. So that's the kind of thing that we should not be investing in because it doesn't work. But we're spending large amounts of money at the moment on precisely those kind of schemes. So I will be arguing for shifting resources away from those and into programs that work. I'm going to skip this because I think we're running short of time. I want to make a general argument that prevention is better than cure. So that you're much better off preventing people from becoming unemployed and then preventing people from becoming long-term unemployed than to deal with the consequences of various policy failures in the past. So if prevention is better than cure, then there's a couple of things that we can do, and some of them that we're already doing. Retention subsidies for employed workers. So in companies where there's a possibility of providing people with subsidies, or companies with subsidies to hang on to staff if there's a temporary downturn, makes a good deal of sense. And that's been done a lot in the European countries to great success. Germany is a particularly good example. And in those contexts, often there's a training component that goes with the wage subsidy, so that when a company is experiencing a temporary interruption in demand, it provides more training for workers, and the state steps in to help subsidise so that the jobs are still there. Those kinds of schemes should be temporary and carefully monitored, particularly if you've got a shortage of resources. Second preventive measure is the whole issue of early school leavers. We know that poorly qualified school leavers are at a very high risk of unemployment. So that, for example, school leavers who left in the middle of the 1990s, even during the boom, their unemployment rates were over 45%, and their situation has deteriorated since. So preventing early school leaving is still an absolute policy priority, and it's much better to catch them before they leave school rather than wait until they become unemployed. So we need to strengthen our efforts to prevent early school leaving, and we need to deliver effective education and training to those who have already left school. And then there's the idea of internships for graduates and for others, and we've seen policy progress on that as well. Training combined with employment experience is probably the best way forward. It would be better if it could be done with private sector sponsorship. In fact, it really requires private sector sponsorship. But we should recognise that if it's for graduates, it tends to help those who are already advantaged in the labour market. So, just to conclude then, in terms of developing a strategic approach, I think first and foremost, the strategy has to be to prevent the growth in long-term unemployment. We have to ensure that people are able and prepared to take advantage of the recovery. We need to make sure that they stay engaged with the labour market. We need to ensure that they increase their skills in order to prevent the drift into long-term unemployment. Because if long-term unemployment continues to grow inexorably, then it just simply becomes much more difficult to get people back to work when the recovery, which will come when it does come. Targeting. We need to provide those active labour market programmes for the more disadvantaged, because we know that people who are advantaged in the labour market, the ones who are short-term unemployed, are much more likely to be able to find their own way out. So we need to target our scarce resources on the people who are going to find it hardest to find jobs. We need to implement preventive strategies where possible, so we need to expand those retention subsidies, we need to deal with early school leaving, and we need to provide graduate internships. And I can see that there's progress in terms of policy on that one. And then in terms of institutions, in terms of state policies and how we organise to achieve this, the first thing we need to do is to integrate benefit and placement administration. You've got to combine income support and activation in the same agency. And there's progress on that. I think the Minister may tell you more about it, but already there's an integration between false placement services and the income support services in the Department of Social Protection. So that's underway, and our understanding is that that's happening slowly, but it is happening. And so by the end of the year, that's supposed to be a fully worked out service. We need to ensure that client-centred services, that services are client-centred. The difference between them is, if I'm unemployed, I want someone to act as a broker for me. So I want someone who's already advising me in terms of job search and so on to say, okay, Philip O'Connell needs a driving licence. If he had a driving licence, he'd probably be able to get a job. And so I need someone to go out and help me to get that driving licence. I don't want to be in a situation where I, as a supplicant, go to a FOSS or a SOLAS office and say, can you give me some training? And they say, yes, you can go for training on this. And the problem with the provider-driven service that we've had for very many years in this country is that people have been told what they can have rather than people finding out what they need and giving it to them. And so it's client-centred rather than provider-driven. And what that really means is that whoever's running the job search advice system, which is now in the Department of Social Protection, should also have a good deal of influence over who gets trained and what kind of training they get. And then finally, we have to ensure that we're getting value for money, because again, the state is broke. We have to make sure that whatever we're investing in terms of solving this unemployment problem is actually investing in programs that actually do enhance the employment prospects of the participants. And for that, we need more intelligence. We need to do more research, more monitoring to maintain up-to-date information on what works and what doesn't work. That's my lot. Thank you very much.